need a cigarette. So this morning I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Gregg Levoy. He's a fantastic person, and I'm looking forward to his kind words today. He's the author of The Callings, Finding and Following an Authentic Life, and the forthcoming Vital Signs, The Nature and Nurture of Passion. Both of those are available to purchase in the lobby, and Gregg is willing to sign your book today as well. He is a lecturer, a seminar leader. He has keynoted and presented workshops at the Smithsonian Institution, for Microsoft, the Omega Institute, and other notable organizations. He's a frequent guest on ABC, CNN, NPR, and PBS. He's taught journalism. He's a former reporter for the USA Today. I really could go on, but I think at this point, I'm just going to turn it over to Mr. Gregg Levoy.
All right. Well, thank you. Wow. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's been about 10 years since I've been back at this church, so I'm delighted to be back. Anybody been here that long? Wow. All right. All right, so I think I'm going to just jump right in. I have a regular writing practice that I do in the mornings, partly to just keep the machinery oiled and generate material, partly to keep unpacking the writer's voice, and partly just because I'm passionate about writing and I love to do it. So what I'm attempting to do is what's called stream of consciousness writing. You've heard the term, or free writing, where my mottos are, garbage is good, and quantity leads to quality. But I'm seldom able to overcome the bad habit of editing while I write. Any of you guys writers? You know this routine? I'm editing while I write. So what's happening is that the critic is essentially on the creator's back during the act of creation. Right? This reminds me of a college roommate of mine who used to study while listening to Bob Dylan albums. And to me, this is like having somebody talking politics in your ear while you're trying to study trigonometry or something. Right? So this is what happens. This is what the critic does. Constantly tosses grammar and punctuation at me while I'm writing, badgers me about my split infinitives and sentence-ending prepositions and, something up with which it will not put. And pesters me to keep going to the thesaurus to get a better word in midstream, and questions my logic, my structure, and even just the truth, when all I want, or I should say all the creator wants, is some momentum, right? And a halfway original idea, all right? And sometimes the fact is I come around in midstream. I come around and I turn to the critic and I say, you, out! When the creator's done, then you can come in and go to town, do your thing, but not until then. Because otherwise what's happening is I'm driving with one foot on the gas and one on the brake. And this is having a constipating effect on my passion and my writing, right? So, this whole drama, by the way, is set against another constraint on my passion for the writing, and that is that when I sit down to write, I'm not just hearing the voice of a critic. I'm hearing an entire brass section of fears and insecurities about being a writer at all, right? I mean, doubts about my abilities and fears of rejection, which in this profession is enough to stun a panhandler. I'm not kidding. And constant comparing of myself with other people, and especially the great writers. all right, who I actually sometimes, how's this for masochistic? I sometimes picture them sitting around my office while I'm writing, laughing and slapping their knees. This does not help. This is like having an autoimmune disease where the body's attacking itself, you know? But, you know, I had a rabbi say this to me once. He said, Gregg, you should write despite all of the arguments against. Because writing is ultimately a labor of love, like service. And like service, it's not about you. It's not about whether you're comfortable or you can measure the effect of your good words, your good deeds in the world, or even whether anybody says thank you. He says it's about something you need to say that you believe the world needs to hear. And you should say it as much because the world needs to hear it as because you need to say it. That was sobering advice. But the fact is that the desire to have passion in our lives, in any form and in any arena, all right? The desire for passion in our lives will always, I think, have to contend with the forces of agents of decay, okay? And distraction, word that means to be pulled apart, all right? Just the forces of resistance and inhibition from both within and without that can pretty easily drain your vitality from you if you let them, all right? But the human psyche, in my experience as well as my observation, the human psyche is kind of like the earth in the sense that it's a closed system, in the sense that there's no away as in running away, ultimately from our own passions and vitalities and senses. There's no out as in throwing the garbage out. You know, there's no trash icon. You know, whatever you push down is just going to come up someplace else in the system. I ran across a Mexican poet by the name of Jose Frias, and he said, I tried to drown my sorrows with drink, but the damn things learned how to swim. Isn't that interesting? Yes. At the very least, they're just going to keep coming back. You know, whatever we push away, whether it's our passions or our sorrows. And by the way, sorrow is just a form of passion. You know, the word itself, passion, comes from a word meaning to suffer. So it's all bundled in there. And these are just really forms of passion. So, but inhibition is not, in my opinion, the enemy. It's not the enemy. This is something that we have to contend with, all right? And frankly, not all passions should be acted upon. You know, there's healthy passion and there's unhealthy passion, and I think a difference between being called and being driven. All right? So, and it's not just a hindrance either. Inhibition is not just a hindrance of something. I think it's also an essential operating principle in the world. All right? Tells leaves when and when not to bud. Tells animals when and when not to shed. You know, you need it in order to have a conscience. You need it in order to have continence. Right? It's the logic behind second thoughts and software that asks if you're sure you want to turn off your computer. And frankly, I think there should be one of these pieces of software for the email send button. So, have any of you guys ever raised a puppy? Anybody raise a puppy? So, this will probably speak to you. I had the experience of, I wouldn't exactly call it a privilege, of raising a puppy once. But I remember being surprised and a little bit appalled at the number of communications in her direction that took the form of commands and inhibitions. It seemed like it was mostly what I was saying to her. Come, sit, stay, lie down, heel, no jumping, quit barking, drop it. You know, does it sound familiar? But the thing is, you need all of this to ensure that an animal gets along in polite society. And because I wanted this dog to be a therapy dog, also behaves reasonably well, at the children's hospital and the nursing home, and doesn't go after the tennis balls that the old folks attach to the bottoms of their walls so that they'll glide more easily on linoleum, you know? And this turned out to be the dog's fatal flaw. And we're talking about a German Shepherd. It was a bad combination. I raised her with tennis balls. It just didn't even enter my mind. But, you know, inhibition is one thing when it's just circumstantial. You know, when when you have to hold your tongue, or you have to get work done before you can let yourself go out and play, or when you just have to do the right thing. But when inhibition starts leaving its toothbrush at your house, this is another story. You know, when it's not circumstantial anymore, or even voluntary, but existential. You know, this is your default position. Your same old unconscious tactic of blocking experience. You know, and playing it safe. Then I think this is time to hit the reset button, in my opinion. Because then your passion-driven movement into the world is being obstructed. And you're in danger of grinding to a halt. All right? So, speaking of how it gets ground to a halt, let me share this. You guys have heard of a poet named Robert Bly? Oh, okay. Marvelous. Well, he wrote a book called A Little Book on the Human Shadow. Little book. You can read it in one evening. And a fascinating read. And he has in there maybe one of the most elegant descriptions I've ever run across for how inhibition becomes sort of an overriding force in our lives and blocks our energies and our passions. And so this is how he describes it. When we're 1 or 2 years old, we have a 360-degree personality. All right? Energy, excitement, you know, exuberance radiating out in all directions. All right? Until our parents start sending us to our rooms for radiating certain parts of it. Okay? I did a consultation with a woman a couple of years ago who told me that when she was growing up, her parents sent her to her room for any displays of negative emotions. Any of you guys parents? Have you ever heard of a child that doesn't have tears, frustration, anger? They punished her for that. No, they banished her for that. I mean, this is really almost in line with some of the religious communities that do what they call disfellowshipping. This can be nasty stuff, all right, if you pretend that they don't exist, right? So, at 40 years old, we're having this consultation, and she's feeling, after a lifetime, of course, of repressing half of her emotional repertoire, she is naturally feeling blocked from being her full, powerful self. And I think the one she's going to need in order to be the healer that she intuits herself to be, and to build a practice around that and a life around that, right? So she quite rightly, I think, describes her mission in life at 40 years old as soul retrieval. Isn't that an interesting phrase? Taking it back. Taking it back. So, Bly says that we each have an invisible bag that we drag behind us, and whatever parts of us our parents did not like get sliced off this nice round pie and stuffed in the bag. Okay? Then we get into school, and in the service of fitting in and having report cards that say, gets along well with others, we slice even more of ourselves off the pie, put it in the bag. Just whole slabs of exuberance and authenticity, self-expression, all right? Carl Sagan, you know Carl Sagan. He once described the difference between going into a kindergarten class and a high school class to talk about science. And so he said the kindergartners, open for business, you know, avidly curious, endlessly enthusiastic, natural-born scientists never heard of a dumb question. The high schoolers, jaded. And the sense of wonder, which I think is an essential ingredient in a passionate life, relegated to kid stuff, something they're embarrassed of, and of course terrified of asking dumb questions. All right? So, then we get into the working world, okay? And to continue winning friends and influencing people, even more of ourselves in the bag. Parts of ourselves that, of course, organizational life would probably prefer that you leave out in the parking lot when you punch in. Your personal life, your spiritual life, your emotional life. You know, I used to go into corporations to do talks on the callings work, and I could not even use that word in the corporate setting. It's just brined in religious overtones. I couldn't even use it. They said, you're going to have to lay it between the lines. You know, so there's parts of us that just get sliced off. All right? So, his point, Bly's point is, out of this nice round globe of enthusiasm and vitality that every single one of us started out this game with, the average 20-year-old ends up with a slice. So he says that we spend the first 20 years of our lives deciding what we're going to stick in the bag, and the rest of our lives trying to get them out again. And this is not so easy. All right? I was reminded of this not too long ago. I went out to visit my twin brother, Ross, and we are hiking in the Santa Cruz Mountains, on a forest trail in the Santa Cruz Mountains near where he lives. And we're having a debate about how susceptible we really are to cultural conditioning. He was in this phase where he was feeling like, I'm not really susceptible to stuff. You know, and we started off talking about advertising. This stuff just doesn't even affect me at all. So to make a point about how, in fact, susceptible we are to cultural conditioning, I dared him to hold hands with me until we reached a bend in the forest path, maybe 100 feet up. All right? And he reaches out his hand, and accompanied by a look that I roughly translated to me to, I call your bluff. And so there was clearly nobody around, all right? But the next 10 seconds provoked an outbreak of reflexes that would have put Pavlov's dogs to shame. Just embarrassment and awkwardness and self-consciousness and paranoia, just pure conditioning. Pure conditioning, you know? All we were doing was holding hands, you know? Just barely pushing a toe over the line, really. And all the alarm bells went off, you know? And we didn't even really dare this escapade in public, right? And I wouldn't be a proper twin either if I didn't report that he broke first. I'm sorry, it's just what twins do. So a few more things that I've learned about how to cultivate passion. You know, what inspires it in our lives and what drains it out of us. So here's just a few notes. Number one, passion can be cultivated. It can be turned on as well as turned off. This is not one from the either you've got it or you don't department. All right? And I think it's most readily cultivated, I think, at the level of the moment, the gesture, the decision, not the 5-year plan. You know what I'm saying? Not the extreme makeover, right? It happens at just the level of the moment, right? I'm sitting around with two of my closest friends a couple of years ago, one evening, and one of them says, you know what the problem is? We're not outrageous enough. And so when I said to him, well, so what would you do if you were going to be more outrageous? And he thought for a moment, and he reached up, and he swept his hair from middle-parted and slicked back to side-parted with a cowlick dangling over his forehead. I mean, just instantly transforming him from Richard to Ricardo. You know, PhD to matinee idol. And he said, I would come into work like this. Little gestures, You know, the point is to look for the subtlest impulses to express yourself. Look for the subtlest impulses to express and to act on your passions, fascinations, curiosities, and build from there. To begin identifying those little moments of choice that take you either toward or away from your sense of aliveness, right? And so just to look for moments like that. Here's another one. I think passion is ultimately in the risk. Passion is in the risk, right? The willingness to step from the sidelines onto the playing field. All right? The willingness to step onto the playing field. And then the act of courage, in other words, itself. Even one bold step past the comfort zone will kickstart it. Right? One bold move. Anybody see the movie We Bought a Zoo? Does that sound familiar? This is based on a true story, apparently, about a family that bought a zoo. And at one point, the protagonist in the movie version, who's played by Matt Damon, says, all you need is 20 seconds of insane courage, and I promise you something great will come of it. You know, 20 seconds of, I don't know about the insane part, but maybe it feels that way at the time. You know? So, in other words, the horse and cart equation isn't necessarily that you find your passions and then begin taking risks on their behalf. But that sometimes it's only by taking risks, by pushing past the comfort zone, by making little decisions, by tossing yourself out of the nest just a little bit, that you begin to clarify what your passions are. See, people often think, in other words, here's a guy that I consulted with who says he needs, as he put it, absolute clarity before he can start acting on a particular passion. Which on the face of it almost sounds like a noble idea, you know, to wait till you have absolute. But, you know, I suggested to him at one point that the clarity he seemed intent on finding, he might only find by taking action. You know what I'm saying? That sometimes the clarity comes only by taking action. Which is the more heroic? Is kind of what I wonder. Waiting until you have absolute clarity before you set off on your heroic journey, or setting off on that journey without having absolute clarity. You know what I'm saying? Which is the more heroic? You know, frankly, sometimes the riskiest thing you can do is to sit for an hour and do your thing. Your writing, your piano playing, your music, your business planning, your fill in the blank. You know? Maybe that's sometimes the riskiest thing. At the very least, risk is utterly relative. I just want to say that. Risk is relative. It's whatever scares you. This is not a comparison game. It's whatever scares you and is capable of bringing excitement into your life. All right? And I think it's not the big scary stuff like jumping out of airplanes necessarily. I think it's way closer to home, and that's really the place to look for it. Taking your jokes to open mic night. You know, being the first to make up after a quarrel. Those kind of risks. Making love with the lights on. Or your eyes open. When somebody asks you how you are, tell them how you really are. These little kinds of just, what they call just manageable difficulty. It's like, you can do it, it's a stretch, it's painful, but we can do it. And I just think that just manageable difficulty is important. You know who Abraham Maslow is? He's the guy who gave us the pyramid, the hierarchy of needs. At the bottom, food, clothing, and shelter, and then belonging, and up at the top, self-actualization, all right? Although his students have added one above that. It's called transcendence. Because even self-actualization, they believe, is still a function of the ego. Open for debate. But anyway, Maslow, who coined the term self-actualization, said, self-actualizing types, these are the people who make the growth choice over the fear choice 12 times a day. I mean, that's a bar set pretty high. But the growth choice, this is why I suggest go for the little ones. Right. 12 times a day. Number 3, passion is not just exuberance. All right? It's also endurance. I mean, sometimes shoulder to the wheel stamina and patience on the order of years. All right? You know who Malcolm Gladwell is? Mr. Tipping Point, wrote the book Tipping Point, bestseller. He calculated once that mastery in any field of endeavor, mastery requires 10,000 hours of dedicated practice. So here's the math. 90 minutes a day for 20 years, or some version of that. You know? How many of you guys have ever been in a play? Anybody perform in a play? Out of 100%, what percentage of your time was spent rehearsing compared to performing? 90-10? Who else? 90-10? You know, I think it's largely passion that explains people's willingness to abide by that equation. You know what I'm saying? To spend thousands of hours practicing the same lyrics or the same lines for the chance to perform it, what, barely a tenth of the time. You know what I'm saying? Unfortunately, we tend to think of passion as a kind of a naturally unstable element. Right? You look on the periodic chart, and under passion it says, prone to degrading quickly in the presence of commitment. You know? And this is really unfortunate. We think of it like it's like a booster rocket in the space program. It launches people into space, but once the orbit is reached, it falls away. We often think of it, again, in any arena, vocational, relational, creative. But I think that real passion has real staying power. I think of one of my heroes, Scheherazade. All right, she's the queen whose stories make up the Arabian Nights. All right, it took her 1,001 nights. That's 3 years to turn the Sultan around. All right, this is a man with a serious intimacy problem, by the way. Every woman he married would be killed on the morning after the wedding. Serious intimacy problem. So, and I have an acquaintance of mine up in Seattle who once told me that he was arrested at an anti-war sit-in once, given a suspended sentence with 15 hours of community service. And the judge said to him, you can do any kind of service you want. So when they let him out, he went right back to the sit-in. He said, I was doing community service when they arrested me. So again, staying power, willingness to keep coming back to the game and not give up on it. And here's the last one. I think that if we lack passion in our own lives, for our own lives, our other relationships are going to be denied that energy. Our partnerships, our families, our kids, our classrooms and corporations and communities and congregations will be denied that energy. Right? And I think it works, frankly, I mean, the point being, obviously, passion breeds passion. Disinterest breeds disinterest. And I think this starts at the one-on-one. Because one person following their passion can have a profound effect on the unfolding of somebody else's in the world. And especially if you're in a position, any position of leadership or stewardship. And I think especially in relation to children and young adults. All right? So I mean whether you are a parent, teacher, minister, mentor, manager, coach, counselor, CEO, politician, this much seems clear to me. Your passion is critical to their engagement. Your passion is critical to their engagement. And the physics of inspiration work not just at the individual level, but the collective, I think. You know, the Gallup company, right? The Gallup polls, they did a poll in 2012 of 142 countries, worldwide poll. And they found that on average, 87% of workers were either not engaged or actively disengaged. 13% were engaged. All right? Now, not engaged means you're checked out. Actively disengaged, what that means is that you are busy acting out your unhappiness and dispiritedness and spreading virus around among your colleagues and your friends and your family and your kids. You know what I'm saying? I heard a business columnist describe that Gallup poll by saying, it's like this. Imagine you're part of a rowing team out on a river. What it means is that one of those teammates is rowing his or her heart out. 5 of them are just taking in the scenery, and 2 of them are actively trying to sink the boat. Isn't that an interesting translation? Wow. And you know what's interesting to me is that there was not even a category in that Gallup poll for actively engaged, i.e. passionate. I don't know. What does that mean? There weren't enough people in that category to make it statistically significant? I mean, that would be significant in itself, you know? I remember somebody hiring me to do a leadership group at a bank in Michigan, and her initial comment was, so why would I want to hire you? I would lose half my sales force on Monday. And I said, doesn't that tell you something? Anyway. So if dispassion is contagious, so is passion. It's just that we have to catch it first before we can spread it. All right? So let me wind up with this. It's one of my favorite stories, and as a beautiful metaphor for this subject. And it comes from the Colombian novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who wrote 100 Years of Solitude and A General in His Labyrinth. Beautiful novelist. So this is the story. A man is trying to solve the world's problems, and his little boy comes running into the room and asks if he can help. And the man is touched by the boy's concern, but he's impatient to get on with it. So he takes a map of the world, and he rips it into little pieces, and he gives it to the boy, and he says, here, you can help by piecing the world back together. So the kid has no conception, of course, of what the world looks like, but he takes this pile of ripped up paper back to his room, and 2 days later comes running back in. Father, Father, he says, I've put the world back together. And all the little pieces of paper have been very meticulously taped back together. And the father is stunned, and he asks, how did you do that? And the boy turns the paper over. He goes, well, on the back was a picture of a person. I put the person back together, and then turned it over, and the world was back together. And then there's just a beautiful, beautiful metaphor. I just love that. So, I just want to close by saying that in the spirit of piecing the world back together, and of course ourselves in the process, I want to say that the workshop this afternoon is just a very hands-on opportunity to explore sort of the state of your own vitality at the moment. Just a snapshot, or a mugshot, as the case may be, of your own sense of aliveness and passion, and what inspires it in your life, and what defeats it. So I hope you'll come. And thank you guys so much for inviting me.